What's up, guys? Today I'm going to change out the water pump, timing belt, and all of the related accessory belts on this 98 Honda Civic. The parts you choose are completely up to you, but I'll have the related parts that I'm using in the link in the description. I'm going to try to keep this video as brisk as possible, getting to the main points, showing you exactly what you need to remove and what you need to do to get these parts changed. First, go ahead and drain all the coolant from the system. Remove all of the 10mm bolts for the valve cover, throttle cable, pull the spark plugs, get the valve cover removed. For room, I remove the cruise control unit and set it to the side, 2 10mm bolts, the plug, and a little hose you just have to pull off. What I like to do, it's a little messy, you'll have a little bit of drainage, is remove the 2 10mm bolts for the top of the power steering line, and then we can pull it out of the way. It gives us a little bit more room to get to removing this cover. Remove the 2 10mm bolts, one's there, and you can get this cover removed. We're going to take off the power steering belt first. So down here, there's a 12mm bolt. You can go ahead and loosen that up. I'm just going to remove it completely, and this one right here, and all the tension will be removed from the belt. If the car has the plastic covers, usually a handful of either push clips or like 10mm screw/bolts that are plastic. Remove those. We at least need to get it removed from this side so we can get to the timing belt and all the accessories there. Next is the tensioner for the AC. On the pulley itself, my finger's pointing right to the front of it. There's a 14mm nut on the front of the pulley. Go ahead and loosen that, and then you can loosen up the 10mm tensioner, and that'll let the pulley slide down, and you can pull the AC belt off. Now, when I mean pull it off, you can pull it off the pulleys. We are going to need to drop the torque mount to get this belt off completely though. And now that belt is just hanging on around the torque mount. So to get access to these covers, we're going to remove the tensioner. As you see, I loosened up the nut and the bolt. So on this bracket, you'll see there's two of them, two 12mm bolts. There's one here where my finger is. There's one directly underneath it. You need to remove both of those so we can get this little tensioner, the whole assembly off of it's off, actually touching the compressor mount. So remove that next. Now you'll see with that bracket removed, it's a little pesky. It'll give us room to remove the bolts when we get this timing cover off. Next, let's work on the alternator belt. There's a 12mm bolt on the top of the bracket right here. It's behind this wiring. My finger's right in front of it. And underneath, this 14mm bolt on the bottom of the alternator. You need to loosen that, not remove it, just loosen it so the alternator will slide forward and we can pull the belt off. Now that we've got the belts removed, might be easier for a lot of you is to go ahead and set the engine to TDC. You don't have to, but it can be so much easier instead of trying to set the cam and then doing the crankshaft. So I'm going to rotate it by the crank, get this lined up, check the mark on the camshaft down here, and leave it alone before we move to the next step. Now to do that, you need a 17mm socket. Spin these until you'll see on the cam gear, this faces up. There's two little marks on the sides of the cam gear. Those should be parallel to the surface of the valve cover. And on the crank, you'll see down there, there's the 3 little dashes and the single dash. That single dash is lined up with this particular mark on that cover, so that way you know it's at TDC for the cam gear and the crankshaft. Next, to remove the oil dipstick tube, there's a little clip. You'll see this, it's right there in the center of those 2 little plastic pieces. Slide that out of the way, and all I did was just grab it on top with some pliers, wiggle it back and forth, pull it straight out. I'm going to first remove the crank pulley before getting to the torque mount. I can do that. You could do either or. I'm going to do the crank pulley first. A few different methods. If you have this particular Honda tool, this slides in here, and you can see on this particular pulley it has the groove for it. You can attach your 1/2-inch ratchet, breaker bar. It's intended to work with a breaker bar like this, and you can pry it up against the ground. I am just going to attempt to use my Milwaukee. This thing usually doesn't let me down. It would be smart if I changed the socket first. Still the 19 on there for the lugs. Okay, let's give that another shot. And this one pulled it right off. A quick tip if you're ever unsure of where TDC is. See at the very top of where the bolt goes in, you'll see the woodruff key. That is always facing up when your crank is at top dead center. Go ahead and remove the crank pulley. Make sure you don't lose your woodruff key. Sometimes they're stuck on there a little bit. What I like to do is grab my hands on both sides and wiggle it back and forth, and that usually kind of slides it right off. That's exactly what I did right now. Now we're going to work on getting the torque mount off and the mortar mount from the engine, because to pull the belt off, well, to pull the old one off, we could cut it actually. But to install the new one, we need to have this open so we can slide the belt in there. Get whatever you're using to support it. I'm using my floor jack and a 2x4 between the transmission and the oil pan. First I'm going to remove the torque mount. There are two 14mm bolts on each side of it. And this one, it looks like a 17. It's either 17 or 19. You can remove that one also. It may not come off yet until we actually lower the engine, but get those removed. Now that the engine's supported, you can go ahead and remove, you know, I've had issues before where trying to get this one off and it doesn't come off. So these are all 17s, there's 3 nuts. Sometimes if this one doesn't come off, go ahead and remove those 2, and then underneath here you'll see a 14mm, there's 1, there's number 2, there is number 3 right there. If you need to, if this doesn't spin, you can remove those 3, but try just this one first and then those 2. If not, remove the 14s and then you can get the whole mount out. No issues for mine. Knocked all 3 of those off, and then you can just slide this bracket off. That's essentially all we need, because when we feed the new timing belt in. So next step, work on getting this plastic cover removed. You're gonna see, like say for instance right in there, there's a 10mm bolt. There's got to be at least 2 on this side and maybe 3 on this side. Get all those off, and there's also going to be, let me see, I think there's a center one. I cannot remember on this particular engine. Oh yeah, it's right here in front of my face. This one right here, this center one also needs to come out. So I believe that's the only one, and then just the surrounding ones on the side. Let me get it removed and I'll show it on camera so you can see exactly how many there are. There's actually 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one actually broke off the little plastic piece. 5, and that's 6, the middle one right there. When I was pulling it off, the crank position sensor wiring's there. You just gotta lift it out and you'll be able to slide it out of the bottom. And then for the torque mount, now that the engine is supported, you can lower it a little bit if you're having trouble, if you're able to just get it off. Stock torque mounts, this one actually is torn, so it just was easy to get off. Stock torque mounts are a little easier to bend than an aftermarket urethane one. So you can slide that off, and now you can get your compressor belt removed. Now at this point, we're close to getting the belt off and the water pump. One thing you're gonna need to remove on this bracket right here, we need to take out this 14mm bolt which holds the bracket for the alternator. The reason being, it goes straight through the water pump. And that is this one right here. It's this bolt hole here, so you will not be able to get to the water pump without removing that. With the bolt removed and that bracket free, move over to the tensioner bolt. It's right there in front of my finger. Go ahead and loosen that up so that way the belt gives us some slack, and we can slide the belt off. Since we're replacing the tensioner, I just removed the bolt completely. Gives you plenty of slack, and with one hand you can get this sucker removed. Next, remove the 10mm bolt on top of the crank sensor. That way we can get the belt off completely. Next, we're going to remove the gear for the timing belt. You can also remove this little washer, the inner washer. And we're going to pull out the oil pump seal. We're also going to clean up the area and we're going to replace that seal. To avoid future leaks, we are using an OEM Honda seal for that particular one. There's different methods of removing it. Just be very careful you don't scratch any of the surfaces where the seal touches on the inner and outer. I usually use a screwdriver just right on the inner portion of it, kind of pry a little bit into the seal, because once you get it started, it usually comes right up. But how you do that is up to you. Just be very careful when getting that removed. And see, let me show you what I do. I'll rest it on the top edge, catch a little bit of the seal, and lift it straight up. And you can see, let me show you right here. It's exactly where I caught it on the seal. I didn't scratch the inner portion of it at all. It's just on the upper lip, which is on the outside. And I've done plenty like that with no issues. There's nothing scarred on the inside of where the seal rests. And here we got the new Honda seal installed. I always do this before the water pump because when you remove the water pump, there's still residual coolant and it just makes a mess down here, and it's a lot easier to get this when it's dry. Now on the water pump you have 4 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, all 10 millimeter. Try to get it off. They may have used some sort of RTV sealant before, might be a little bit difficult, but we need to get this removed. Mine came off easy. Once I had the 4 bolts removed, I just pushed down on the pulley and it just came right off, shot all the water into here as well. You can see this one is, it says Honda on it, so it's an original water pump. Definitely was time to replace. The car has 150 or 60, I can't remember how many 100,000 miles it has on it, but definitely past its time frame. Another thing, in case you get mixed up on the bolt sizes, there's 2 sizes. There's a long one and the short one. The short one is always the bottom left. On these 3 are the same size. Now the last thing we're going to remove and replace is the cam seal. 12 millimeter bolt here. You could sometimes use something, so we're going to spin it this way to loosen it. Maybe slide a screwdriver in here and rest it on the head of the valve cover right here. Should be perfectly fine. What I usually do is I'll place like a sock there and then put the screwdriver through, so it puts the pressure on that instead while we remove the 12 millimeter bolt. Now I had slid my screwdriver in through here, rested it on the corner, was able to get the bolt removed. And you can see all I did was scratch up this corner, just barely right there. And that's not even where the valve cover gasket goes. The valve cover gasket goes right here, so it didn't do anything at all. Now we have access to that seal. Go ahead and get it removed and replace that one. Once you've replaced the seal, go ahead and get that cam put back on. Apply some thread locker, get that torque to spec. And now we just need to go about installing everything. First off, clean off any residue around the edge of the water pump. And then get your new gasket put on and install it. You can torque these. I usually do in a cross pattern. These are 7.2 foot-pounds of torque. After the pump's on, go ahead and get your new tensioner put on. And you're just going to put the bolt in and feed it in and just tighten it up a little bit so it doesn't fall off, because we're going to put the belt on next and then we can tension it. Here we got the tensioner and the pump on. Next, slide on the washer and slide on the gear. This is still loose. This is the sensor because we're going to feed the belt in here, and that's why I put the belt on first, then we'll put the sensor back on with that 10 millimeter. Now feed your belt in around the mount, pull it around the gear on the bottom, around the tensioner, around the water pump. See if you can get it installed. Everything is still set at TDC, so it should be okay. Once the belt is on, we are going to start putting on everything down here. So make sure you get your crank sensor retightened. And now I can put on that lower plastic cover. With the cover back on, we can go ahead and reinstall the crank pulley. And I usually will add a little bit of Loctite here. And you need to torque this to, I believe, if I remember correctly, 134 foot-pounds of torque. With the crank pulley on, We need to install the belts in order from inside to outside. So first, your alternator belt. You're gonna need to reattach that bolt we removed for the bracket. Then get your belt put on and then go ahead and tension it. While you're doing that, don't forget to tighten this one to tension it. And once you have proper amount of tension on the belt, you can tighten the 14 at the bottom, which is attached to the bracket. Now when you have your belts off, depending on where you ordered them from, like obviously they have different numbers depending on the belt. Rock Auto is really cool. Like this is set up for this particular car. It tells me alternator belt is this 4K 795, so make it really easy for you to identify which is which instead of just trying to figure it out by measuring them as compared to the old belts. Moving on from getting the alternator belt on, the next is the compressor. So feed over your belt over the torque mount. You know what might be a good idea is getting to these two bolts for the tensioner bracket. You can see it right here. So I'm going to actually attempt to install it right here because now I have a lot more room and it'll be a little bit easier to get that on. I tightened the bottom bolt for the tensioner bracket, but before tightening up the top one, go ahead and drop in your oil dipstick tube because once this is tightened, it kind of removes some of the room and it might be more difficult to get that in. And with that bracket on, go ahead and install your belt, slide it in, and then you're going to tighten it by tensioning the bolt here. Once you're happy with the tension, you'll tighten the 14 nut on the pulley itself. Once that belt is on, what I like to do before going any further, I am going to spin the crank and make sure the marks line up for the camshaft and for the mark on the timing belt cover and the crank pulley. I want to make sure everything's set because next we're going to put on the cover for the cam gear and then we're going to start doing the power steering. It's a lot easier to check it now instead of having to back up a little bit just to check your timing again. A tip also before doing that, what I like to do when I spin the crank just a little bit, it basically removes the slack on this side of the belt and then I'll tighten the tensioner. That way the tension is always on this side where the tensioner is going to remove any of the slack over here. So after spinning it, my marks lined up perfect. That mark I showed you earlier, it lines up, I don't know, I think you can really see right there. Lines up perfectly with the cover on the camshaft. So that's something you want to verify. If yours is off a tooth or so, looks like at one point they put some like paint on here or something. I like to mark it and then shift it which way you need to. Of course you'll loosen the tensioner, slide the belt off, and then using a wrench, get in there and either spin your camshaft either forward or back one tooth just to get it lined up and then double check again that you have all your marks correct. So go ahead and install the gear cover, just those two 10mm bolts. Next, reinstall your power steering pump. Got the two 12mm bolts. Leave them loose because we need to put the belt on and then I will show you how to tension it. With the belt installed, see this little square notch right here? I'm using my 3/8 ratchet with the 1/2 inch adapter. This will go in here and then you'll see how you can move it. This is basically going to tighten the belt. And then while you're applying that sort of tension, you can tighten. I'll start by tightening this 12 because once you get this one tightened, it usually won't move much at the bottom. And then that'll remove all of the tension from the power steering belt. Next, you can reinstall your power steering line. Go ahead and put this on for your motor mount bracket. I like to do this last because with that out of the way, it just made it a lot easier to access everything. And then hook up your cruise control. Go ahead and reinstall your torque mount. And the last thing we're going to do is get the valve cover put back on, but we're going to replace these first. The easiest way that I found to do these was get the rubber separated from the metal washer. And then you just want to cut these off because we have the replacements for them. If you don't, then of course you're going to want to reuse those, but if you're doing all this work, definitely just want to replace these with your valve cover gasket. And so those pop right off like that. And then on the new one, get the washer separated from the rubber. Sometimes it's easier to go from the inside like that. Now, don't forget, put your metal washer on first, and then these. What I will do, just leave them like that, get a little socket. There you go. Got the new ones installed. Finish up all 5 of those and we can get the valve cover gasket ready to put on. And now just remove your old valve cover gasket and the spark plug tube seals. I'm going to go ahead and replace those. Then we can get that put on. What I do, I will apply RTV silicone on all 4 corners here. And I won't start the car for 24 hours after doing that, so that way it dries completely and we avoid any sort of oil leaks. And that is pretty much it, guys. After your valve cover's on, put the throttle cable back on, ground wire, vent tube, spark plug wires. And now what you can do, of course, fill your coolant. You're going to want to check maybe in a day or 2 if any of these belts have loosened a little bit because they tend to stretch. So you can tension all of those as they're on the car now. But that's it. If you're curious, this job for the D series timing belts is very similar on the 88, 91 Civic and CRX. The only difference may be on the sedans. Sedans will have power steering on the LX and EX. I've seen some CRXs and hatchbacks have it as well. But a lot of them won't, so you won't have to worry about any of the power steering components. It makes it a little bit easier in the way, but the compressor belt and the alternator belt are essentially the same. You won't have the crank position sensor, but that job is almost identical to the 96 to 2000 Honda Civic, so you can use this as a guide also when doing your timing belt. Thanks for watching today, guys. Try to keep it as brisk as possible. Hope it helps you out. If you have any questions regarding anything during this install, leave them in the comments. I'm going to try to leave a link for all of the torque specs if you're curious on that. I found one online that's pretty good. I'll put that in the description as well so you can go through there and use any of those torque specs you may need to use. Take care. We'll see you guys soon.